41, and then give me your attention then, and we'll get into some detail there with it. Thank you for choosing to being out on a midweek service. I appreciate it much. This evening I want to speak to you on the different identities of Joseph. And of course, here we're talking about Joseph in the Old Testament. And I want to speak to you about the different identities of Joseph. We'll give you some statements which I have written and then guide us into some thinking here with the Scripture. And so as you've been out and about doing all the things you do on a Wednesday, I tickled watching you all coming in. And it was funny, our 7 o'clock crowd was pretty sparse. Our 7:05 was pretty healthy. 7:07 was getting pretty full. And so you can see why we actually sing all the verses of every song. Gives folks a moment. Wednesday night is the most interesting one of all to make it in. And I appreciate the effort that it takes when you're coming straight in from work and school and everything else and yet making time to be in church. And so I appreciate the effort that goes into that. Joseph in the Old Testament. He was a man whose external identity changed drastically during different times in his life. In fact, his external identity changed so much that when his brothers stood before him and spoke with him 22 years after they had sold him into slavery. Now consider he wasn't sold into slavery as a baby. He was 17 years old. And it's 22 years later when his brothers are standing in front of him and he identifies himself to them. After that 22 years, they did not recognize him. They did not know who it was talking to him. They had no idea at all. And so Joseph, his identity changed throughout his life. And a lot of times, various times, he had a different identity. If you wanted to identify Joseph, according to what was going on in his life and what his position was, he'd have these different identities. Think about each of these. He was a son. Then he was a slave. As a slave, he also became a servant. Then he was second in command. And then he became salvation's vessel for the nation of Israel. A lot of different identities for him down through his life. In each identity he had, as a son, as a slave, as a servant, as second in command, as salvation's vessel, in each identity he had things which were out of his control and things which were under his control. Although his external identity changed, the true internal identity of who he was and who he became remained unchanged down through those years. Now, listen, this is the message here. Catch this because everything else builds on it. The fact that his internal identity remained the same, even though he was a son and a slave and a servant and second command and then salvation's vessel, he remained Joseph. And the reason that happened was because he paid attention to the fact that his response to those things which were under his control and his giving care to taking care of what was under his control affected him far more than the, often momentous things that were outside of his control. There were some pretty big things happening in his life. But what really kept Joseph being Joseph was the fact that he attended to or he took care of those things which were under his control. He had different identities as he goes through life. And, you may not have complete different identities. I mean, I understand you're identified differently. Like myself, I am a brother. And I am, even though I do not have living parents, I have been a son. I am a pastor. I'm also a Christian man. I'm a citizen of the United States. I'm an uncle, and I'm a grandfather. And I have these different identities, We had occasion for something going on in school. My wife and I saw Marlia, and we didn't know we were going to see Bradley. We was out in the hallway when we were coming through. We saw him too, and they saw me. They didn't say hello, Pastor. They called me by my first name. They said, Pappy. That's Pappy. There's Nemo and Pappy. So that's our identity with them. But our identities aren't as stark as what Joseph's went through. And no matter what phase of life you're in, there are always things outside of your control, and there are some things that are under your control. A lack of growth and sometimes out-and-out damage comes because people get very focused on what is outside of their control to the neglect of what is under their control. Who you are, the decisions you make, and how you decide to behave are far more important than the circumstances which come to you in life. I'll give you examples of these. We're going to look at each of the identity of Joseph in relationship to those things which are out of his control and relationship to those things which were under his control. Let's think of him as a son for a moment. Let me give you some of the things that were out of his control. The dreams that came to him were something that was out of his control. Remember, his brothers started hating him because of the dreams he had. Joseph didn't ask to dream the dreams. Say, well, he shouldn't have told his brothers. I'll let you debate that with yourself. You're welcome to whatever opinion. If you have conflicting opinions, enjoy the argument. But I'll let you do that. But I do know that he didn't ask for the dreams. He wasn't seeking those from God. God put that in his heart, and God, because Joseph would be very prophetic in his life, as well as many other things, God was showing him something. Joseph did not ask for that. That was outside of his control. You say, well, that was actually a good thing. That's fine. It was still outside of his control. It's not something he set up or asked for. Here's something else. The favoritism shown him by his father. By the way, if we want to absolutely add a huge open door, a double door open, to add damage to a child's life, one of your children's life, you make it obvious that you have favoritism towards one child over another. You are setting the stage for disaster when you do that. And look, let me talk to you about something that some of you won't like to hear as a parent, but I'm going to deal with you a reality. You need a reality here with it. Sometimes a child's personality, one child's personality does not blend as well with a parent's personality as another one does. A parent and a child can have very different personalities. In the relationship, it takes an extra step to keep a sweet relationship, because if that were not your child, I'm not saying you wouldn't like them or you would despise them, but when your child, it wouldn't be a natural attraction because of the personality type. And that's a reality. People say, oh, I love my children all the same. No, you don't. Get over yourself. You do not. My mom said she did too. That was just to make my brother and sister feel good. But it was, no, you don't. You love them all. Or you should. You love them all. And your love for them is genuine. And there's not one you want to love over the other one, but you don't love them all exactly the same. You don't communicate the same with each. And they don't communicate the same with you. Do you know that someone who grows up, and I'm not talking about somebody who's got real problems with relationships and stuff, but they're more of a keep to themselves type person. They're not as expressive by nature. They don't show their emotion as much. And again, I'm not talking about in a damaged situation, but just somebody they're a little more reserved in those areas. A lot of times they grow up that way. They started out that way, and as a child, they may not have been as cuddly as another one was. I have a cousin, and in my mind, I commend her for something she did. This cousin of mine, neat lady, I've always gotten along well with her, and she doesn't much like to be hugged by anybody. Now, I have a hugging family. That's funny. Oh, Faith We were both about lost on Sunday, didn't we? And she looked at me and I looked at her and I thought, what in the world am I doing here? It's funny. You say, are you a hugger? I'm a hugger to my wife. And those females that are related to me, you say, you believe in having a hug in church? Ladies with ladies, men with men, that's fine. But here's the thing about it. I walked out that door, and it was the weirdest thing in the world. I'm going to chalk it up to his almost 60-year-old brain. I was walking out the door, and I had either just looked over and said something or something in communication with Lauren. Well, that kid right there is about the same size as Lauren. And I was going out the door, and I looked. I knew she wasn't her, but she was standing right there, and you caught it. We talked about it after the service. I sat there, and honest to goodness, instead of reaching over and saying, hey, Faith, like that, I reached out and started to just hug her up to my side. And I'm like, hold the door. What am I doing here? And I stuck my hand out at the last second. And I could tell later on we talked about it. She's like, she told her grandma, she said, I think Pastor almost hugged me. Yeah, you're the wrong side. So please, you two never stand together, if you would. Died laughing the one time out here. Logan was standing against the wall. And Sister Frances, of course, you know, she only had one eye. And she was walking down the hallway, and I was standing, and Logan was standing. Well, she walks right up beside me, and she was talking to somebody. Next thing you know, Sister Frances Smith reaches over and starts rubbing my arm like that. Well, they've known my boys since they were babies. So she, you know, she's always hugged them and everything like that. She'd rub my arm. She just walks up in the hallway, and she'd rub my arm. And what she did, Logan and I were standing near each other. And, of course, bless her heart, she can't see out of the one eye anyway. She glanced over, and she just saw the profile of the face, and she does this. And I knew what had happened. I looked at her. I said, feeling friendly today, are we, Frances? And she's like, ah! You know, as you can do. And she just totally lost it, you know. But my cousin, she just doesn't like people hugging her, whether they mean to or not, you know. And yet her children are all affectionate in a hugging way. And there were times she told me, herself, she said there are times they'd come up and hug me, and she said I'd sit there and hug them back and everything. She said they'd leave the room and I'd just go, huh. She just is not a hugging person. And she said, but they needed hugged. You see what's happening? I'm trying to tell you that Joseph didn't ask to be made the favorite. That caused a lot of grief for him. He was the youngest and the favorite. And it wasn't just in some out-of-the-way ways that he was the favorite. He had a very stark, visible display of his father's favoritism. And that's the well-known multicolored robe that he wore. And that was a big deal to have a garment like that. And so Joseph didn't ask for that. That's as a son. But you know, those things were there. He didn't ask for that. You know what else he didn't ask for? He didn't ask for the hatred of his brothers. His brothers had animosity and even was described as hatred. They just despised him. Absolutely despised him. As a son, Joseph had all these things that were not under his control. However, what was under his control as a son, he was a faithful and obedient son. You find that he was obedient to his father when his father sent him to do things. And he was so faithful that his father could trust him to go check on things and come back and give him an accurate report. Which, by the way, didn't do him any good in the standing of his brothers either. They're sending the youngest kid brother to go check on the other ones. That's just not a good move either. But he was faithful. And what he was doing by him being the type of son he ought to be, regardless of the other circumstances, regardless of the things that he couldn't control, him deciding to be the kind of son he ought to be, set the stage for him to go on to be the kind of man he needed to be. And he had an incredible life in front of him, even though he didn't know it at the time. And then, as a slave, okay, for this is simple. When they took him out of the pit, paid for him, hauled him down the road, basically nothing was under his control. Zero. I mean, nothing at all. And the only thing that he could have control over at that point, I mean, he didn't get to control when he ate. He didn't get to control when he traveled. He didn't get to control where he slept. He didn't get to control who he was around. He didn't get to control anything. He had no rights. And so what happened was, the thing that shows up, even though we don't have much recorded at all about that point from the pit until he gets down to Potiphar's house, we don't have that journey. We don't have that, traveling as a slave and what camp may have been like at the nights. And then by what means he was sold as a slave and what that looked like as far as being marketed, like an animal or something. We don't have all that detail, but we do know by what came out on the other side of it that he maintained his integrity before God during that time. Because Joseph didn't come into Potiphar's house as a griping, complaining, bitter young man. I imagine there were a lot of tears. I imagine there were tears when he was by himself and questions. But he took care of what he could take care of, which is his own integrity with God. And he did do that. Then he was a servant. He became a servant in Potiphar's house. And who and where he was to serve were things that were out of his control. He didn't come down to Egypt and say, I'd like to apply for a job at Potiphar's house. I hear they're taking applications. That wasn't his choice. He didn't get to choose that. That's who bought him, that's who got him, and that's where he went. What responsibilities he had at that house were not his choice. He didn't say, I'd like to be the gardener. I'll take care of the animals. What happened was, he was put wherever they put him, and he excelled. So before too long, he's over the whole place. But he didn't have control over what they had him do. And that led to the problem. His vulnerability to false accusation was something that was out of his control. There are situations I just would not put myself into. Not doing it. So why? Because there are some things that just make you very vulnerable. That's just not smart. You just don't do it. By the way, that's something our generation needs to hear. It's called decorum. And it's called having good sense. What situations you put yourself in and what involvements you get yourself with. Many a tragedy morally is started just by casual friendship. And so there are many things I won't do. It was a funny thing. My sister was up visiting once and we were doing something. I said, Sis, you may or may not understand this. You and I are not running into town together today and grabbing lunch or something. Say, that's your sister. How many people in Lancaster know that? Do you want to know how often? And not like I'm a famous person. I've just been in town a long time as a pastor. You want to know how often I walk in a public place without someone greeting me as a pastor? Almost never happens. Most places, it's a number of them. That's how they know me. They don't know that's my sister. You say, well, in our town, there's a lot of ministers take different women out. And I know that. And they're idiots. IDIOTS. I said the word I meant. They're idiots. And I just can't do that. You say, well, that doesn't seem right. Because, look, it's not sensible to do things that can bring damage and disgrace. I had this one server years ago, about 2 years ago, and she'd slide into the booth to take my order. Now they'll lean, they're walking a lot, so they'll lean and stuff, but this one would just slide in, set everything down, how are you doing today? And I'm like, no. So what I'd do, I'd go in, I'd take my briefcase, I'd take my computer, I'd take something and throw it over there. Why? Just keep her out. Remember when we used to do we pass out the blessed promises out here at the Golden Corral? There was a woman there from an organization that was there, and we had talked while we were doing things because the organization was there, and we were there passing out blessed promises on Veterans Day. And that last time we got to do, we gave out 600 in the one night, and then I got to say a few words there by there, and we prayed over it. Some of y'all helped bust tables and stuff. We had teenagers did that the one night. And anyway, this lady was there, represented another group, and we were standing near where each other was and talked for a few minutes. No big deal. She saw me in town at a restaurant a week after that. And I was sitting there, had my Bible out and stuff, and she said, "Hey, Pastor," she says, "anybody here with you?" I said, "No." She'd been too friendly before, and she said, "Can I sit down there with you?" And I said, "No." She said, "What? No." He said, "I wouldn't do things that way." "You have at her." "No." And she goes, "Really?" I said, "Really?" I said, "You may have offended her." I wasn't trying to offend her or not offend her. So you find this amusing, don't you? You'll be a preacher in a town for a while, for a lot of years, and see what you do. You ladies don't do that. But, he couldn't choose that. I've had men in our church talk to me about situations where they needed to avoid something at work, or they had a situation and they're seeking God's wisdom. I need to make a right decision, and man, I don't trust this situation or that situation. And they just want to stay, just watch out for some things. Joseph couldn't do that. And Potiphar's wife was an evil and an immoral woman. There wasn't no doubt about that. But he had no choice. That old boy was stuck. He couldn't say, "Hey, you know what? This isn't working. Man, this woman keeps hitting on me." And she did. Read the account of it. Time after time after time. It says every day. And he couldn't leave. He couldn't say enough of that nonsense. "I'm going to go get a different job, or I won't have to put up with that." He was stuck. So he didn't have any, he had no power over thing that put him in a bad situation there. And this wasn't just going to be somebody talking about him. This ended up landing him in prison. He had no ability over the evil intent and malicious accusations of an evil, lust-filled woman. That was out of his control. There was nothing he could do about it. But you know what he could do, and what he did do, is he resisted over the long haul. He refused. The Bible uses that language. He refused. He didn't just, we'll talk about that later, or make some excuse. He said no. It'd be a good word to get in your vocabulary for some things. No. Well, let's just talk. No. No. Do whatever language you need to. No. Whatever dialect. No. And he kept refusing. He kept resisting. And by the way, he had sense enough to know when it was time to get him out. He said, "I'm out of here." You said he still ended up in jail. Yeah, but he didn't end up in fornication, and he didn't end up losing his own self, and he didn't end up losing his integrity. Oh yeah, he got lied about and put in jail. Oh yeah, he got put in prison, and that wasn't a happy thing. But you know what? He went to prison knowing that he was still right, and he went to prison knowing he was still clean. He kept who he was. That's the only thing he had power over. So there he was as a slave, and then a servant. And by the way, he gets down to the jailhouse, and guess what happens with that? There are a lot of things he had no control over, but you know what he did have control over? Doing the right thing. And God was with him. That's the phrase that keeps showing up in Joseph's life. God was with him. Do you know one reason why God was with him? Because Joseph wanted to be with God. He even with Potiphar's wife, he told her, he said, "How shall I do this wicked thing and sin against God?" He said, "No." He said, "Somebody came down with me when I was sold into Egypt." God came with me. And God's still watching. And just because his circumstances were something he didn't understand did not mean that he needed to do something in an evil way. And then when he became second in command, watch this one. The impending famine and the tremendous needs of the nation of Egypt and all the nations around it, which were dependent on that nation, were things that were out of his control. I'd like to be given that job. Say, that's awesome. We think about it this way, and it is true. Man, he was made second in charge. Yeah, 7 years before the bottom's going to drop out and the whole economy is going to collapse. Hey, you're in charge. And 7 years from now, everything's going to be wiped out. So you better make these first 7 really good. Second 7 aren't going to be as enjoyable as the first 7. So he didn't have any charge about or anything about that. He was all these things that were put on him. He's put in second command. He didn't get a vote on him. Pharaoh didn't say, "Hey, I'd like to know if you'd like to do this job." That wasn't how it worked. He said, "Well, what if he had refused?" What do you think would happen if he had refused? Does the word expendable come to your mind? It should. You got to understand, in a situation like that, with someone like Pharaoh, it's not, "Hey, I'd like you to do this. Oh, I appreciate it, but I don't want the job." You don't walk away from that. And so he's put in charge, and here's where we'll get into Genesis 41. But what happened is, him giving a good testimony to Pharaoh was under his control. Look at Genesis 41. A lot of things, everything coming up to that point. He had so many things that were out of his control. Now he is standing before the king of Egypt. And he does what he can do. We begin in verse 9 of Genesis 41. It says, "Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day." Yeah, 2 years previously, he had promised Joseph he'd speak a word for him to get him out of prison. 2 years he forgot him. And that's the word. He just forgot him. It's a long time. And I remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house. And both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night. I and he, we dreamed, each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was there with us a young man, a Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man, according to his dream, he did interpret. It came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. Can you imagine what a day that'd been? He's doing whatever he's doing in the dungeon. And they come get him. Hey, we're going somewhere. He's got to be wondering. There's got to be some fear saying, what in the world is going on? You're going to stand before Pharaoh. What? He said, boy, I bet he was excited. I bet that had a lot of mixed emotion. That could be going either direction in a hurry. And so they said, come on. And then what happens? They brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. He wasn't presentable. And there was certain decorum, a certain way he had to be before Pharaoh. And they get him there, and he comes in, and he's standing face to face with Pharaoh. And it's just, it'd be overwhelming to most folks. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I've dreamed a dream, and there's none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. Now, hold on a second. Sunday we dealt with Arioch and a couple of them that were schmoozers in the Bible. You know, hey, look at the man I found. If ever there was a fellow who might have been tempted to capitalize and say, the man you're looking for. I mean, he's standing before Pharaoh. This is his chance to shine, but look what he does. And this is indicative of what's been going on in his private life up until that point. And he says, I've heard of thee, verse 15, end of it, that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And so when he stood before the ruler of the land, he's taking his first breath out of prison, and he's looking him in the face, and Pharaoh says, I've heard about you, and I think you can help me. His first statement is, it's God that's going to do it. And he just puts that out there plain and clear as anything. Why? Because he was doing what he could with the things that were under his control. He wasn't under control being in jail. He wasn't under control being brought before Pharaoh. But he could be under control who he gave praise to. And so Joseph zeroed in on what he could do. Then, being exalted to second command over Egypt, which is what happens next, was out of his control. As I said, they didn't ask him. They put him in the chariot, drove him around, said, bow the knee. I mean, he goes from being a prisoner to they're coming through with Pharaoh's chariots and everybody's bowing down to this guy. He's in charge. And he had no say-so in that. But being wise and diligent with the opportunity put before him was under his control. Look down and going on in chapter 41, look down, let me start you in verse 37. Look what happens here with this in verse 37. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in all the eyes of his servants, in the eyes of all his servants, not in all the eyes. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this? A man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God hath showed thee all this, there's none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house. And according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. By the way, parentheses, I wonder what Potiphar's wife thought when she found out that news. Just a thought. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand. Very, very important thing he did there, transferring authority, not eclipsing his own authority, but transferring his authority into Joseph. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or his foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. And Joseph, look at what he did, went out over all the land of Egypt. So Pharaoh says, you're in charge of all of Egypt. Think that might be overwhelming? Tell me what classes Joseph had for running a massive kingdom. Tell me what experience in life had made him ready for that. Do you know where he had been the last several years? In jail, part of the time. Now, Potiphar's house wasn't just like, our house. It was a household where he had servants and that. But compared with running this nation, especially with an impending crisis coming at him, wait a minute though. So Pharaoh says to Joseph, you're in charge of all the land of Egypt. Then the next thing we find out is Joseph, as soon as that ceremonial parade's over, Joseph goes over all the land of Egypt. He was diligent. He checked out everything he was over. He went and found out what was going on. He looked it over. He got involved in it. Why? So he could know what it was he was running. He didn't just sit back in the royal city and say, well, you do what I say. He went out to find out what was going on. And when he did that, of course, he was showing diligence with it. And then his salvation's vehicle, how he ended up in Egypt and his brother's abiding hatred of him was something completely out of his control. But the decision to not exact vengeance, but rather show mercy, were things within his control. And by exercising that control, he aligned himself with God's heart and purpose. I'm going to read to you 2 verses, which will remind us how Joseph's brothers had treated him. And then I will take us to verses to read about how Joseph ends up treating his brothers. And it'll show you how he chose to keep his true identity and all the different things that happened in life. There will be things that will come and press on you in life to take you very much off center of who you actually are. There will be things that will come to undermine, weaken, and destroy your faith. There will be things that will come of a corruptive nature, try to take you to where you aren't. You know where you shouldn't be and who you actually are. And you won't like who you're becoming. You know, that fellow we were finding out about on Sunday and the son that was lost. First thing it says, well before he came to the Father, he came to himself. He's like, wait a minute. What am I doing here? What am I doing here? What am I doing here? I talked to a man, wouldn't know him at all. Actually, he's no longer living, but he's telling me one time his testimony about how he came to serve the Lord and how the difference the Lord made in his life. And he was talking about when he was in college, he had gotten involved in some of the things where he was in the party scene and all that with some of the sports teams. And he told me, and we were talking, and he said, I said, so what was the pivot point? What happened? And he said, I was at a party one time. He says drugs going on and varsity squad football team, this particular college, all this stuff here, and all the debauchery we wouldn't even want to name going on. And he said, I suddenly looked at it, and he said, I said to myself, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? This isn't what I believe. This isn't who I am. This isn't what I want to be. So I got up and walked out. Not everybody does. Sometimes they get swallowed. Each of us, we have the option and ability to choose the starting point of sin in our life. You don't get the option and ability to choose the stopping point. But don't you believe people can repent and get right? I do. But even when you do that, there's two things. You don't know the long-term ramifications that you've caused in your life and in the life of others. I'll tell you, and I hope you'll catch this because it's not going to be bombastic. I wish we had more respect for the seeds that we sow and how dangerous our flesh really is. I see a lot of carelessness among God's people about the seeds they're sowing. What we accept in entertainment's become very degraded, very debauched. Moral conversation has gone down. Decorum, appropriateness. These things are almost laughed at among God's people. We really need to get to a point where we understand that seeds bring forth plants. You plant for wrong seeds, you're going to get a harvest you're not looking for. But surely as you mow the wrong direction and blow all those grass seeds and weeds into your garden, you're going to lace your garden with weeds. You're going to do the same thing in your flesh. Hey, you can't be dumping a bunch of raunchy music in your brain and keep your heart right. Can't do it. And I don't care if it's Christian raunchy music. When the music's raunchy, I don't care what words they put on it. You're not going to put a bunch of sensual animal beat in your brain and keep your flesh under control. You're not going to listen to music that glorifies every perversion there is and keep your heart right. You're not going to do it. You can't feed it. You can't keep feeding it. You can't keep feeding it and not expect it to take you over. And so, man, we've got to keep that in mind. Let me give you these verses about how Joseph's brothers had treated him, and I've got them written down here just to read them to you. But now Genesis 37, this was recounting, of course, when Joseph was at home. It says, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. You ever been around people who just can't be in the same room and talk nice to each other ever? It always goes into an argument and a fuss. I'm not going to ask you who they are. How many of you knew that? I honestly know that. I know some people like that, man. You get them together, 5 minutes, it's going to be fussing. And they talk, their tone of voice is harsh, mean, and cruel to each other right from the beginning. Someone can say, pass me the potato salad, and the next thing is going to be, what do you want more of that for? Can't you get it yourself? It's that kind of thing. There is no, they just can't behave like reasonable human beings around each other. That's the way his brothers were. Can you imagine? He couldn't go in and out of the tent without someone saying something about him. I imagine him going by those older brothers, some punk. And they're just little things they'd say, all the time. Now, pay attention to that, because they could not speak peaceably to him. You say, well, why couldn't they? Because out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. And they hated Joseph, and it came out in their speech. But let's contrast that. Look in Genesis 50. Let's look at the contrast here with what he did. Now, Joseph couldn't stop that. His dad had made it worse. Israel just did not make a good move there. But Joseph couldn't help that. And somewhere along the line, he decided to take charge of himself and do things the right way. Joseph decided that no matter how he had been treated, no matter how he'd been on the receiving end, that he wasn't going to perpetuate that. At some point, we got to not let the hurt. The hurt needs to stop. We need to not pass it on. You say, well, do you know how it made me feel to be treated that way? Do you know how it made you feel? If you do, then choose not to do that to somebody else. Say, well, I'm going to get back and make them pay. You're not going to make them pay anything, and they don't care. You're wasting your effort. And you're embittering your soul. Stop that. That's not the way God gives us to have victory. I long for us to understand this. Genesis 50, and look down in verse 15. And these fellows are up to their ways of doing things. Verse 15. And when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead. Look what they say immediately. Their dad dies. They said, Joseph will peradventure hate us. Why would they think he'd hate them? Because that's the realm they worked from. And will certainly requite, which means pay back or give them back in measure, will certainly requite us all the evil which we did unto him. They had never forgotten the pit. They had never forgotten selling him. Nothing. And as soon as their dad died, they're like, uh-oh. Because they think, well, the only reason why Joseph's been so good to us is because of Dad. And now Dad's gone and Joseph's in charge and we've got problems. Verse 16. Can you imagine what this seemed like to Joseph? And they sent a messenger unto Joseph saying, thy father did command before he died. Don't you love that? Yeah, I love people. Well, I know what Grandpa really would have wanted. I know what Dad really wanted. I know what Mom really wanted. Give it a break. They sent a messenger unto Joseph saying, thy father did command before he died, saying, so shall ye say unto Joseph, forgive, I pray thee now, the trespass of thy brethren and their sins. For they did unto thee evil, and now we pray thee, forgive the trespass of thy servants, of the God of thy father. They hid behind everything, didn't they? Look what they said right there. Here's what Dad said. They're lying. They're lying. And then they say, you be good to us. We're the servants of your God. And they're dodging behind Dad, dodging behind religion, everything here. Thoroughly repugnant. Then look at the response. And Joseph wept when they spake unto him. He just cried. These old boys never did get it. Never did. Joseph had been sold into slavery, but those brothers had been in bondage all those years. Look what he does. And his brethren, verse 18 there, also went and fell down before his face and said, behold, we be thy servants. Here's how Joseph kept right. And Joseph said, am I in the place of God? And Joseph had figured out along the way that he wasn't God. And he wasn't God's judge, either to be a judge of God or God's judge to judge others. He said, am I in the place of God? He had figured out the whole thing of vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And God said, if you take vengeance on yourself, then you're trespassing. Joseph said unto them, fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, he's very real about it. You thought evil against me. He's not sugarcoating it. But God. So how can I get victory over these old hurts and stuff? But God. And God's real. It makes a difference. But God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. By the way, not just his family. Do you realize entire nations and the nation of Egypt, actually their very lives were spared during that horrible famine because of what had happened there with Joseph? Oh, by the way, look at verse 21. Now therefore fear ye not. I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them. Look at the end of that verse. What did he do? Spake kindly unto them. That's along the order like, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. That's like Stephen. Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. We won't do that in the flesh. We can go through a lot of religious motions in the power of our flesh. But that kind of heart and living doesn't come about because of the power of the flesh. And there were a bunch of things in all the identities of Joseph. There were a bunch of things he didn't have any control over at all. But somewhere along the line, he decided to focus on what he could do. What he could do was he could remain true and right to who he should be before the Lord. And God give us grace to do that. Let's pray, please. Father, thank you for your words. Thank you for your people. Lord, may this be sobering to me, to these who I've spoken with. God, may we be sensible towards you with it and actually allow it to work into our being so that we live this. God, you desire truth in the inward parts. Lord, how I think about people I drive past, people I see out in public, my response inside, things I never articulate. You want those to be right, true. I confess before the congregation, before you, Lord, I need your grace. Lord, I believe your people. Many of them in this room have an appetite to follow you. Help them, please, wherever they are in their walk, and you know where that is, Lord. Just help them to take the next steps they need, please. Amen. Let's stand together. Song of invitation. Come ahead.